From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
Super. No.
Why so
Not
flamboyant today?
Just all of the things seem to happen all at once.
Yep.
Can't just be one thing and then a little break and then another thing. It's just all of the things all at once.
Yeah, it's like Australia Day hit. And then, the world woke up and, we actually had to go back to work and deal with, big,
just
difficult
too much things, not enough brain is where I'm at.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah.
So it's nice to be able to take some time out and just
sure
record a
is.
podcast, right?
Chill out, have a chat, talk to some interesting people. Yep,
too easy. And we have two of them today, so we should probably.
We do, yep.
It's a little bit awkward because they're in the studio with us
It is
today,
extra unusual. Yep.
Yeah, so don't really want to talk over the top of them. We should probably invite them into the conversation.
Good call.
Okay, cool. So Kathy, and you know what?
You didn't check how to pronounce Kathy's last name.
I never do any prep, and this is coming to bite me again. Kathy, how do we pronounce your last name?
How would you pronounce it if you had to read it?
Did I get it right? Naumczyk.
Really close.
Naumczyk.
Really good attempt, actually. Yeah,
Okay.
It's Naumczyk. It's a
Naumczyk.
Polish one. Yeah, it's
Oh, mate. I really apologise.
No
I'm
need
not
to
good
apologise.
with
I'm
even
very
basic names. So, yeah, okay, good. So, Kathy is an Assistant Director, Psychosocial Regulation at Comcare, leading a specialist team to deliver the Psychosocial Inspection Program. Welcome, Kathy. And Luka is her colleague, Luka Campbell, I can say Campbell, is the Director of National Regulatory Programs at Comcare. So welcome to the podcast. Welcome to Perth as well, because both of you aren't from Perth, are you?
That's correct.
Where are you guys based?
So I'm based in Sydney, and I should say thanks very much for having us on the podcast. I hear that we're sitting in a brand new studio here. So thanks for putting it all on for us. So I'm based in Sydney. But Kathy's based in Melbourne, but we lead a team that's spread right across Australia. So we've just welcomed another assistant director based here in Perth. So it's been good to come over to the western side of the country and spend some time with our new team member.
Yeah, great. And we've kept it nice and cool for you, particularly you, Kathy, coming from Melbourne. So none of these 40-degree days for you. So you're quite lucky this week.
I heard you had one just last week.
Yeah. They
had,
happen fairly regularly.
Three weeks in a row of heat waves, I think. So, not great. But, that's Perth life, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. My team is also spread all over Australia. So, comes with some unique challenges, I think, managing a distributed team like that.
Yeah, it certainly does. And our team has grown quite significantly over the last 18 months. So Kathy and I spent quite a bit of time making sure we had the settings right for our team, that we were balancing the need for them to have focused and, that time to concentrate on work and to tasks that need to be free of distraction versus keeping them connected to each other and being really cognizant of the fact that we want to have a shared sense of purpose and collegiality despite being at different locations. So it's definitely challenging and something we've continued to tend to over the last 18 months.
Yeah. So what podcasts do you both like to listen to?
I'm happy to kick off.
Kathy?
Yeah. Look, I think for me, podcasts, anything that has Brene Brown, Simon Sinek, I love their podcasts. However, there is one that I listen to for self-care, and I thought that's probably a good one to highlight here today. And it's called Is It Just Me? And essentially, it's just a lighthearted comedy type podcast. In every episode, they have an Is It Just Me? And they sort of talk about it as a group. And sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's serious. But I really enjoy that.
So kind of normalizing the human experience a little bit? Is
Absolutely. Yeah. I was thinking about if I got an opportunity to say, and is it just me, what would that be? And under pressure, I couldn't really think of anything, but what came to mind was, is it just me, or when you see hot air balloons, is it the most amazing thing? Like, it's always just such a beautiful and exciting thing. Everybody stops what they're doing, and I don't know. Is it just me?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Nice.
been a long time actually since I've seen a hot air balloon.
I think that's
in the
probably,
wild.
you know, why
Yeah.
it's special, right? Because
Yeah.
you don't see them all the time. Yeah. Luka.
Yes, well, I am a big podcast listener. I just let you into a little bit of a personal anecdote here. So I'm currently renovating our laundry at home,
Oh no.
and things haven't gone completely to plan, and I'm
Shocking.
not the most efficient at my construction skills. But I do tend to put my headphones on and listen to podcasts when I'm doing stuff like that around the house. So I've got three that I wanted to mention. So the first is it's a podcast called The Westminster Tradition, and it's about public sector governance, and it actually does some analysis into the circumstances behind robo-debt and the subsequent inquiry into robo-debt. Really good analysis, and one I'd recommend to any of your listeners who might be public servants, whether it's in the Australian public service like Kathy and I, or in state or territory public agencies. It's a really good listen, and it actually draws on some other examples from the public service beyond robo-debt, and including recently there was a podcast on the postmaster scandal in the United Kingdom, which was fascinating to listen to. So that's my number one. Number two is the Ezra Klein Show, and I've just discovered that there's a website that indexes all of the book recommendations that come off that podcast, which I'm very excited about. Great listen if anyone's interested in US politics and policy. Very good sort of intellectual debate that happens. Some really interesting guests on that podcast. And the third is it's a podcast called Cautionary Tales.
Oh, I love that one.
By Tim Harford, and it is, it's great.
It's fantastic. Yeah.
A good narrative style. Some accidents and some pretty heavy stuff in there, but his way of storytelling is really engaging.
Yeah, that is a great one. So professional careers, please.
Might start with Kathy.
All right, let's do it. So I studied social work and criminology, and throughout my career to date, I've always had some type of connection to mental health. I began by practicing in the sort of community sector, in a youth service and a community legal service. And then I commenced my public service career around 10 years ago. I started off in a social work role in a crisis intervention setting at Services Australia. I then spent a couple of years working in the humanitarian program in Home Affairs. I then moved over to Australian Border Force, which is where my psychosocial sort of career started. I was working there in a program lead to implement and deliver a culture and behaviour program, which is aimed to mitigate the culture of non-reporting in sort of law enforcement settings. And so this program was really about reporting or giving people a safe and anonymous reporting pathway to disclose experiences of harmful behaviours so that the organisation can do something about it, so that we know where it's coming from and what can be done. And so that's how I discovered the Work Health and Safety Act and the regulations. And at that time, it was 2022 going into 2023 when the regs are coming out. And I was just from then fascinated by it, really. And an opportunity came up, and I've been with Comcare for the last year and a half. And my role in Comcare is overseeing the psychosocial inspection program, which we'll talk a lot about soon.
a few agencies there probably are quite rich in psychosocial hazard exposure. So probably some good background there to come into this role. Very cool.
And we're very glad to have Kathy on board. It's been an interesting ride. We've had a lot to deal with over the last 18 months as the team's grown at the rate it has. But we're very lucky to have Kathy's skill set and all of that experience over here at Comcare.
And can you tell us your work experience, please?
Sure. Before I do, I just want to kind of let you in on a little bit of a joke. Not so much a joke, but just an anecdote. So we were recently asked at a leadership workshop with my colleague directors across Comcare. We were asked to raise our hand if any of us had thought we'd end up as a work health and safety regulator when we were studying at high school. And I think there was one person in the room that raised their hand. That wasn't me. So my journey to work into work health and safety, and then specifically to work health and safety regulation, has been not a straightforward one, convoluted, and hopefully the sort of life experience that I've brought has helped me now in the role that I have. I studied, so my area of study at university was nursing. So I did a Bachelor of Nursing down at Deakin University in Geelong. I found that the unit of study that I liked the most was called Population and Public Health. And so I sort of did a bit of a slight pivot after my nursing studies and ended up in public health. So I did a Master's of Public Health. What really appealed to me about that subject was the notion that a lot of the determinants of health are actually not in the healthcare system, but they're in society at large. So if we can shape society in such a way that it promotes health, then we end up with much better health outcomes across the society. So public health was a real obvious choice for me in terms of my interests. I then did some work at the University of Sydney while I was in a health and safety role at Fire and Rescue, New South Wales. Did a special research project which was aligned to my work at the time. And through that, I sort of started to understand more about the regulatory environment in which health and safety sits. And I'm still interested in research, so I ended up starting with Safe Work New South Wales as a research officer in the Centre for Work Health and Safety, which is a research institute that was sitting in Safe Work. And I got so engrossed in that subject that I thought, right, this is fascinating. The nuts and bolts of regulation are actually really interesting, and this is a career that I can really make a difference, and I can see the impact that I'm having. And so decided to jump over into the inspectorate and was successful in getting a role as an inspector with Safe Work. So I continued on that sort of inspectorate trajectory for a couple of years. Eventually moved up to the position of Assistant State Inspector with the Health and Safe Design Directorate. And in that role, I had some visibility of psychosocial risk management, but I was very interested in that subject matter. So when the role opened at Comcare to come and lead the psychosocial regulatory function, I jumped on it, and it's been fantastic. Comcare is a great place to work.
And can I just say, the team and I feel so lucky to be led by Luka as well.
Aren't they sweet to each other?
I was going to say, where's the straw? Why don't you ever say anything like that to me, Joelle?
Would you like me to answer that question honestly, Jason?
Please don't.
I think a lot of parallels there, Luka, with why people are drawn to doing psych health and safety work as well, right? Because work is such a significant determinant of health outcomes, both physical and mental health. And so, I have clinical psychs in my team who were drawn to working more upstream because they were just, working in with workers' compensation schemes and those sorts of things, and consistently seeing people coming through with psych injuries from work and seeing the same patterns of what was happening in the workplace that led them to that injury in the first place, that they kind of get sick of it and go, no, I'm actually going to try to fix those problems rather than mop up after them.
And knowing that they are all preventable.
Yeah, the upstream, downstream metaphor is actually, I think, quite helpful in work health and safety.
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah, I think work health and safety regulation has been a little bit focused on that sort of individual intervention. So some of the work that Kathy and I have been doing has been trying to push to that sort of more upstream focus, where we can deal with, at the organisational level, the meso level, trying to deal with, well, what are the upstream factors giving rise to these downstream issues?
Yeah, and we do see a lot of health practitioners look at workplaces as an opportunity to go in and, improve maybe self-care behaviours or offer things like resilience training. But I think what we're starting to see is that more and more of them are understanding the benefits of going upstream and looking at the systemic drivers of health outcomes rather than purely the nitty-gritty at that individual level. So, no, it's great what you guys are doing. But I guess for our listeners who aren't familiar with Comcare, it'd be great just to have a brief overview of what it is that Comcare is and what it is that you are responsible for.
So Comcare, Comcare is the national work health and safety regulator. And we also, so there's sort of two key functions, which is one, work health and safety regulation, and two, workers' compensation authority. Our jurisdiction is a little bit more complex than what might be the case in states and territories. So under the Work Health and Safety Act, we regulate all Commonwealth agencies, as well as some licensees, private sector licensees who are self-insured under the Safety Rehabilitation and Compensation Act.
So we're here today to talk about Comcare's approach to psychosocial health and safety. So can you tell us, from Comcare's perspective, why is psychosocial health and safety important? And in particular, why is there so much attention being paid to this issue at the moment?
Yeah, sure. I think we kind of touched on a few parts of this just in the introduction there. I think what I'd say to begin with, and then I'll hand over to you, Kathy, to add. So we know that mental health is a societal challenge. So it's not a challenge that we should attribute to individuals. It's a challenge that we should attribute to society. The existing work health and safety framework, when it was introduced in 2011 under the Model Work Health and Safety Act, did contemplate psychological health as a function of health. So if you look up the definition for health in the Work Health and Safety Act, you'll see that health includes both physical and psychological health. And so regulators have always had an interest in mental health in the workplace and prevention of psychological harm that's caused by or contributed to by work. In 2018, a statutory review of the Work Health and Safety Act was undertaken. So when Parliament's enacted the Work Health and Safety Act, there was a provision included, which was to undertake a statutory review at the 5-year mark after it had received assent. So that review was undertaken in 2018 by Mari Boland, who's now the head of Safe Work Australia. And one of the key recommendations of the review was that that Safe Work Australia make model regulations dealing with psychosocial risks in the workplace, to give duty holders, such as employers, persons conducting a business or undertaking, and workers, to give them clarity on what was actually required of them when it came to managing psychosocial risks. So Safe Work Australia did that. They went about a very extensive consultation process, engaged with all of the state and territory regulators, and engaged through their industry representatives on what the changes to the model laws would be, and subsequently those changes to the model work health and safety regulations were enacted in most of the jurisdictions across Australia. So that's the kind of summarised version. There are a lot of contextual factors that were occurring at the same time as the Boland Review and in the lead up to the changes to the model laws, which I won't go through in detail, but your listeners might be interested in looking at the Productivity Commission review that was referred to in the Boland Review. Had some very interesting analysis and good commentary around the role of work and the role of the workplace in terms of promoting mental health and preventing psychological injury.
I can understand why you'd like that from your public health background.
Yeah, it was. Look, it probably was a bit nerdy of me to go that far into the detail, but it was. I think, really related to the idea that as a society we should structure systems to try and optimise people's health and well-being.
Yeah, and both the Boland Review and the Productivity Commission inquiry, they were key recommendations, right? I believe the Murray made it recommendation number 2 out of 34 when talking about updates, and then it was one of 5, I think, key priority areas for the Productivity Commission as well. So they're both flagged as really essential.
That's right, and it's in a context. I mean, I think we often think about Australia as being, we're fun-loving larrikins. They're things that we hold quite central to our sort of national sense of identity. And of course, the Productivity Commission didn't talk about those types of cultural norms, which is totally appropriate. What I found interesting, though, is that the rate of mental ill health in Australia is actually is above the average across OECD countries, which is usually who we would be comparing ourselves against. So despite the national kind of identity that we have as being those fun-loving larrikins, unfortunately, we apparently aren't doing enough to prevent mental ill health in our society.
Yeah. And ultimately, every worker, regardless of your role, your background, has the right to a healthy and safe workplace, including one free from psychological harm. And I think as our societal awareness has grown regarding the detrimental impacts of psychological injury through the evidence that has emerged, so too has our focus on how this harm can be prevented. But I think from a regulator's perspective, it's very exciting to have this sort of broader societal shift behind this legislation as well.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the FlourishDX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow FlourishDX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the FlourishDX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode. I guess, yeah, it's interesting how this has all come about, and we've seen all the regulators, I guess, adopt the recommendations, including WorkSafe Victoria. They adopted the regulations. It's the minister over in Victoria that hasn't adopted their recommendations for new regulations.
Well, I don't know that we could say that they've adopted them.
Okay, well, they have put them forward into draft.
They've drafted them, yeah.
Drafted them, yeah. We're waiting on the decision. I guess, though, in terms of how Comcare considers some of the definitions and what's important, how does Comcare define psychosocial hazards?
Yes, so this is one of the great things about having a nationally consistent framework under the model work health and safety laws.
Victoria.
I think you might be alluding there to just there's one particular jurisdiction in Australia that
remains nameless.
So Western Australia, where we are now, has been the last state to come on board.
Well, like to think most recent. rather than last.
Sorry, yes, the most recent. So what I was going to get to, just in terms of the national consistency, is it means we don't have variation across the country when we as regulators say that unfortunately quite bureaucratic term of psychosocial regulation, which doesn't exactly flow off the tongue. At least we're talking about the same thing. So the definition of psychosocial hazards is set out in the Model Work Health and Safety Regulations, which have been adopted in most jurisdictions, including in ours, the Commonwealth jurisdiction. And it defines psychosocial hazards as hazards relating to or arising from the design of work environment, plant at the workplace, or workplace interactions or behaviours that may cause psychological harm. And the regulation states that they may also cause physical harm in addition to psychological harm. The Code of Practice provides a bit more colour to that definition and context into what's meant by the quite technical definition there. I'd encourage anyone that hasn't read the Code of Practice to read it, and also to look at the appendices. So Appendix A in our Commonwealth Code of Practice sets out the hazards relating to harmful behaviours in the workplace, and Appendix B sets out the hazards relating to the design or management of work. So different treatments and different risk controls might be required for those different hazards, and they may have different sort of latent effect in terms of latency, as opposed to immediate harm that they might cause.
Yeah, and we've definitely seen that from our own data doing consultation with our clients. That the harmful behaviours you don't need a lot of exposure to for them to cause quite significant harm, versus things like work demands, cognitive demands, emotional demands, which generally take a little bit longer in terms of that latency period that you're talking about.
Yep. It's hard because there are no strict rules about some of these things, and there is a degree of proportionality and sort of consideration of the context that needs to be taken into account when you look at individual matters. So the regulations aren't going to tell you that in situation X, then Y applies. It's going to set out a set of principles. It sets out a set of principles, as does the Code of Practice, as to the sorts of things that need to be taken into account when confronted with that kind of a risk assessment or when controlling a particular type of hazard.
So, Kathy, the Commonwealth Code of Practice for managing psychosocial hazards at work was released late last year. Any significant differences between that code and the model code?
It's largely reflective of the model code, but there are some key differences. The big one is the introduction of 3 additional hazards. So we have job security that was specifically highlighted and is recognised as being a psychosocial hazard. And this sort of relates to employment that lacks assurance of stability or certainty. And we know that this can cause increased stress and anxiety, and can even be a barrier to reporting unsafe working conditions. The next one on the list is intrusive surveillance, and that relates to excessive surveillance tools that are used to monitor performance. Now, that is it's very clear in the code that monitoring for the purposes of health and safety is not considered intrusive surveillance. And the last one being fatigue. So that's recognised as being its own hazard, and that relates to that physical, emotional, or mental exhaustion, which reduces a person's ability to work safely. So there are some other key differences. The other one being that the hierarchy of controls must be followed when managing psychosocial risks. That's quite unique to our code.
Oh, in Queensland.
Oh, at Queensland, okay.
Yeah.
Good to know. And also the code details 10 principles of responding to reports, complaints, and incidents of psychosocial hazards. So it really details some practicable practical and tangible strategies that can be used to safely respond to psychosocial hazards. And this includes ensuring confidentiality, providing timely responses, involving workers in the process, and maintaining a supportive and non-judgmental approach. And lastly, our code features some case studies right at the end. So if you scroll right down to the bottom, you'll see, I think there's 5 case studies in total, and they have some examples across different industries.
So the model code, just for context, provided some examples which were great, great for the state and territory regulators, but included industries that we don't have a lot of, or any activity in those particular industries. So it was necessary for us to, for our department, the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations, to make modifications that made it contextually appropriate for the Commonwealth jurisdiction.
Yeah. I remember it would have been probably 18 months or so ago that Comcare released some really great case studies of how they were regulating certain hazards. And they had some, it wasn't just the common ones like bullying and sexual harassment and occupational violence, but you had some examples in there, I think, like poorly managed change and organisational injustice from memory, which I thought was really cool to give some practical examples of that.
Yeah. No, we've recognised that it's necessary, people are asking for those examples of what do we see as non-compliant, what do we see as good practice. We have recognised there's a bit of a gap at the moment in terms of what we're sharing with our jurisdiction in terms of examples of what compliance does look like and what good practice looks like. So the program that Kathy and I are about to launch in April, the Psychosocial Inspection Program, we'll actually be getting our inspectors to document those good practice examples and asking for permission from the agencies that we're inspecting to share them with the rest of the jurisdiction.
Yeah, it's a great segue, actually, because that was the next question. So you're going to be launching that. You're calling it a psychosocial inspection program. So can you give us a little bit of detail about what that program is going to look like?
Sure. Kathy, do you want me to leave your voice to rest for this one? And I'll try and... No worries. Sure. So we're pretty excited about this. The program's called the Psychosocial Inspection Program. We piloted this program in 2023 and then into 2024. We had 5 organisations participate in the pilot inspection program. And we subsequently evaluated that independently. So we had an evaluation performed by the University of Queensland to look into our processes and the stakeholder perceptions of how the program went. What it involves is our inspectors. So it's a regulatory program, and inspectors are boots on the ground. But we take an educative and advisory approach. So inspectors will look at what PCBUs are doing to manage psychosocial risks within their workplaces. They'll speak to senior officers, health and safety representatives, and speak directly with workers to get a real clear picture of the practices, not just the policies and procedures that are written on paper, but how they're being applied in practice. So our inspectors look at all of that. They do review the organisational kind of training documents in terms of health and safety commitments, performance measurement of psychosocial hazard and risk management, and then provide advice back to the PCBU on compliance with work health and safety duties, as well as what can be done in terms of continuous improvement. So the pilot was really successful. The jurisdiction found that it improved stakeholder knowledge about psychosocial hazards and risks. It improved organisational commitment to psychosocial hazard and risk management. And a majority of the participants also thought that the organisation was more likely to treat psychosocial risk management seriously as a result of the inspection program. So following the pilot evaluation, Kathy and I have been busy making some changes to the program to allow us to implement it at scale. One of those has been dramatically expanding the size of our team, which we've done. So that's been the most important thing. But then there's quite a lot of sort of administrative processes that we've had to set up behind the scenes, as well as making those improvements so that we're not just looking about, we're just not looking at sort of the deficits in the health and safety management system, but we're actually also looking for those good practice examples and building the capability to share that with the rest of our jurisdiction.
Yeah, there's definitely more need to share good examples, and we find it hard ourselves with our conference. We have industry case studies, and people often ask me, like, who's doing this really well? I can say, well, look, I can tell you there's some companies out there that are doing aspects of psychosocial risk management really well, but they haven't nailed it, right? So I think what we're seeing is you can do case studies of like elements of a strategy that companies are doing well, but it's hard to find someone who's like followed it beginning to end and has that to that point of continuous improvement, as you're saying, which is where we want companies to get to, rather than seeing this as a one-off kind of process, updating the risk register and being done with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of it, there's very little that you can do in terms of applying a cookie cutter approach. Everything, even the good practice examples that we'll be cataloguing, will still need to be contextualized based on whichever organisation it is.
But people love a cookie cutter approach.
That's the big challenge with managing psychosocial hazards, right? And in particular with controls. Like, you've got a working at height hazard. You know what your control options are there. We bring the work down to ground level. We put barricading in place. We use fall protection. Those are your options basically. When we're looking at something like, low autonomy, well, we need to actually understand what is it about, what aspects of the autonomy are the problem for people, what's okay and what's not, and then what can we actually do in the way that job or that work is designed so that we can actually address that aspect of poor autonomy. So your controls are always going to be really bespoke based on the way that particular organisation operates, the way that job fits in within the context of the organisation and their team and all of that kind of thing. So it's very difficult just to say, here's your controls. That's what it is on the hierarchy, and you need to implement the most effective of those that you can. It's a lot more challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there has been a sense of, I think our jurisdiction has in a large part been really supportive of the need to manage psychosocial hazards and risks better. But I think it'd be an accurate reflection to say that there has been a little bit of anxiety, and we've done all we can to try and alleviate those concerns about how do you go through this process. The regulation is quite clear in terms of what needs to be considered in terms of managing a psychosocial hazard. Regulation 55 capital D sets out the things that have to be taken into account. So that's why I say there's not much in terms of the cookie cutter approach, because to apply 55D, you really need to think about the local context. But I think there's also a good opportunity to innovate that sits behind psychosocial risk management. It's not a sort of zero-sum game of like, if you manage psychosocial risks, there's going to be a bottom line cost to your operations, or if you manage psychosocial risks, then things are just going to become less efficient. I actually, from what I've observed so far, there's some actually really good examples of where hazardous work has been substituted for work that's less hazardous. For example, exposure to traumatic events and materials, investing in the software capability to actually reduce that exposure and use computer technology to minimize the extent to which humans are exposed to some of that material. There are some obvious co-benefits to that if we can solve the issue of exposure to psychosocial hazards like traumatic events and material, while also, reducing the business expenses in terms of managing that process, then I think it's a sort of win-win situation.
Yeah, and a lot of what we see, especially when we're exploring excessive workload or work overload, which is, probably 90% of the time is the primary or the top hazard that comes through in our analysis. When we explore that, a lot of that is inefficiencies that people are managing, reworking or, redundancies that aren't necessarily there for any good reason. They're just there because they haven't been able to prioritize fixing it. So kind of entering the same data into 3 different systems manually, or administrative processes that are unnecessarily bureaucratic and, delayed decision making or, decisions that need to go up and down a hierarchy, again, unnecessarily. All of those sorts of things, and role clarity as well, right? Where you've got sort of work coming in and it's not really your job, but you're not sure whose job it is, so you just kind of do it anyway. So all of that feeds into that workload issue for people and that sort of the intolerable demands side of things. But there are really clear benefits to businesses from actually getting across all of that outside of the psychosocial harm. You are talking about improving efficiency, improving productivity, time to deliver, all of those sorts of things. They're all benefits.
Absolutely. Yep. I think investing in our leaders to help them, to provide them with the skills to effectively manage people and tasks in an environment where we're no longer in the office all the time, so there's not line of sight management available, which can also contribute to those delays in sort of getting approval when you can't walk up to someone's desk and say, hey, is this okay? You've got to send an email and then that's got to be escalated. There are some aspects of work to do with the physical location in which work is occurring now that can be contributing to things like job demands or lack of role clarity. So we really need leaders to have the skills to be able to lead in the environment in which they're operating. And if that's a remote environment, then they need to know how are they going to manage people effectively, give those clear boundaries about what they can do without consultation from their leader, what do they need to escalate. And so I think what we do see is when those things aren't set out, when those common understandings about work and the way it's going to be organised aren't set out clearly, it can create an environment in which psychosocial risks are prevalent.
So, Kathy, if we've got a duty holder and they've got a psychosocial inspection coming up, what can they expect, both in terms of process and then outcomes afterwards?
Yes, I think Luka touched on some of the things that we do, like the methodology of the program. But what you can expect is a holistic compliance assessment of your organisation. And as Luka mentioned, we engage with a range of stakeholders to paint this picture for us. So we start off with the document inspection to understand the infrastructure of the organisation, and then we go out and test with the stakeholders that we meet to understand how it operates in practice. So we will meet with HR teams, that being mainly the employee relations section, as they have a significant role to play. The work health and safety team, we will meet with senior executives to understand how they understand their duties and their obligations and how they understand their organisation's commitment to psychosocial safety. We support the organisation to administer a worker survey that goes out to all workers in the organisation. And we also offer some facilitated worker interviews as well. And the final sort of engagement step is engaging with HSRs, so health and safety reps, if an organisation has them. And so essentially at the end, we'll draft a report with our findings. And as Luka mentioned, we will highlight strengths to support the organisation to understand what's working well, we'll identify any opportunities for continuous improvement. And if there is non-compliance identified, we will obviously outline immediate actions that need to take place. But none of that will be a surprise. We will make sure that we are working with the duty holder throughout the course of the inspection for them to understand where they're sitting and raising any urgent actions that need to take place as soon as possible. So we expect that this process on average takes about 3 months.
Yeah, okay.
And I might just mention, the duty holder will have at least 4 weeks notice before we go in.
And is that similar to other types of inspection processes that Comcare conducts, or is it quite an unusual process?
It's quite unusual. So in terms of we call them reactive, but I think it's probably more an accurate term would be more responsive regulatory approach. When we receive a work health and safety concern or a notified incident, we respond to that like immediately. Once it's gone through our triage process, it's assigned to an inspector. Whereas this program, we're giving at least 4 week lead time with the agency, because we're not intending to go out and sort of it's not sort of a gotcha exercise. If a compliance can be achieved prior to us attending site, then the outcome has been reached without us having to direct it. So that's good for us. And it's not that it's different when it comes to the responsive regulation that we take for our sort of general work health and safety matters, but there's more urgency to respond to those quickly. And we do that usually within a sort of 4 to 6 week period is what we aim for in terms of closing off an inspection under the sort of traditional stream. Investigations have different timeframes around them, and we also have separate to our psychosocial inspection program. Our inspectors do a regional, we call it the regional engagement program. It's a proactive inspection program focused on a particular topic each year, where inspectors visit every PCBU in our jurisdiction to look into that particular thing. That they happen on varied timeframes, but usually it's a quicker process than what Kathy's outlined here.
What would happen if one of your duty holders was to request a proactive inspection and then they were found to be horribly non-compliant?
Yes. So, or the first part of that question. So, if a duty holder or a PCBU, if an organisation requests an inspection, that we actually absolutely accept requests. We'll be standing up a website shortly, which will have information about how to register interest in participating in the program. So that's certainly an option that we want to continue being available for our jurisdiction.
And we'll definitely, once that link's available, link it to this episode. So if people are listening in the future, then hopefully they can find that website nice and easy.
Yeah, and depending on when this airs, it might actually be already there. So, yeah.
I believe that when I see it.
There's
I've been involved in IT development before.
Have you?
I can imagine government being even slower than a startup as well.
No, unfortunately, I have no visibility. I just have full confidence in our colleagues over.
They'll get knocked out of here.
So the second part of your question was what happens if inspectors find non-compliance on one of those sort of requested inspections? And the short answer is that the inspectors won't follow a different approach on the requested inspections compared to the risk-based inspections that we incorporate into the program. Our inspectors have autonomy to form their own reasonable belief about whether compliance has been achieved or not, and we guide our inspectors in what appropriate response might be in different circumstances, but ultimately the inspector the inspector will exercise discretion over what's the appropriate tool in the context. So if there was a really extreme health and safety risk perhaps not even a psychosocial risk, but a physical hazard that an inspector came across in the workplace, they might issue a notice to correct that because it's something that just simply can't be walked past. No different to a psychosocial hazard. If something requires further examination, but it falls outside of what our scope is with the psychosocial inspection program, our inspectors will refer that to another inspector to go off and make inquiries into that matter, to keep our inspectors focused on what we need to look at for the psychosocial inspection program.
Yep.
And I think it's important to highlight as well that we give all of this information to the PCBU right at the start. So we set those expectations that this is exactly what can happen if non-compliance is identified. So they have a guide to the program, and this information is contained in there as well.
Yeah, and that's why I asked the question, because I'm sure that would be one of the hesitations of someone participating if they're not sure of what would happen if they weren't compliant.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of companies and organisations, your duty holders, maybe have been reluctant to start for whatever reason. So probably know they're not compliant and probably don't want you coming in and having a look just yet.
Yep. Well, I think it comes back to the anxiety and the sort of apprehension, I think, that we sensed shortly after the psychosocial regulations were incorporated into our legislation in the Commonwealth. I think that what you need to think about is the comparison in terms of the risk. If the risk is sort of at the low level, similar to, let's say, a slips, trips and fall hazard, it won't always attract the attention of the regulator. If it is an extreme hazard, and it may still be a slips, trips and fall, but causing significant risk to workers and to the public, then that will attract the attention of the regulator. So the yardstick is sort of not really clear, but I would encourage duty holders to think about the sorts of things that, to apply a risk-based lens to the issues that they're dealing with. And the things that are more at the more extreme end of the risk assessment and the risk calculus are the ones more likely to attract the regulator's attention. And just because a duty holder doesn't put their hand up and say, I want an inspection, doesn't mean it won't come to our attention and be dealt with through our ordinary work health and safety concerns process.
Yeah, because I can imagine, obviously, there are lots of benefits, particularly for leadership in those organisations, understanding what they're doing well and what they still need to maybe improve. I mean, the worst case for them, they do get an improvement notice, which says that there's something seriously missing in their approach. How long would they normally have to respond to an improvement notice?
Yeah, there's this is another thing that our inspectors have. Our inspectors are able to make the call on how long is required, but inspectors will always consult with the duty holder on whether the time frame given is reasonable, or if there's any objections to the time proposed before issuing the improvement notice. So if it's to develop a process for dealing with a particular type of traumatic event, for a small organisation, that might be able to be done in a couple of weeks, whereas a very large organisation, there may be some unforeseen consequences of changing a process that need to be weighed up and considered by the PCBU to prevent exposure to other psychosocial hazards or other types of work health and safety risks.
Yeah, and that's it, like being reasonable in terms of how long it's likely to take based on the size and complexity of the organisation and how long or how big a piece of work it is, right? I do remember it wasn't Comcare, I won't name the regulator, but there was a very large organisation that I'm aware of that got given an improvement notice because they didn't have a safe system of work for psychosocial safety and they needed to stand one up, and they were given 1 month to do that. Yes, I think but I think that's an education thing, and clearly you're educating your inspectors, people in your team, to know what is a reasonable amount of time to achieve these activities.
Absolutely. So Kathy and the team, we have our own inspectorate team, but it's not. We don't stop there in terms of the uplift that's needed in terms of inspector capability. So our team work very closely with the regional inspectors across Comcare because we're not, it's a generalist skill in terms of regulating psychosocial hazard. Just because we have the specialist psychosocial regulatory function doesn't mean that it stops with us in terms of psychosocial regulation. So our inspectors are working very closely to make sure that all of these somewhat complex concepts are well understood across the inspectorate. I would also mention all of our inspectors at Comcare apply what we call the compliance and enforcement policy, Comcare's compliance and enforcement policy, which is available on our website. One of the principles under that policy is that we encourage our jurisdiction to take its own responsibility for compliance. So that doesn't mean that we won't step in and direct compliance, and our inspectors absolutely do that. But we want our jurisdiction to be mature enough to be able to solve health and safety issues and to be able to achieve compliance with minimal intervention by Comcare. So obviously that's not the case in every circumstance, but inspectors will consider that compliance and enforcement policy when they're taking regulatory action.
So where can duty holders or other people who are interested find out more information about this particular inspection program?
Yeah, so hopefully our website will be up and running. So we will have that information published there. We also have an animation that's coming out, which is specifically about the program. So if you wanted to promote it or watch it, you can. But in terms of psychosocial hazard management, Comcare offer a range of various education materials. That's online learnings that are free, that anyone can jump on and access. There's also some facilitated training and online courses that can be completed, and that's all through Comcare's website. There's also a lot of information just about psychosocial hazards more generally. For example, we have a page that details the various psychosocial risk assessment tools that can be used, and it compares each of them and can it just gives information about what they do, and if you're looking at using one for your organisation, it just provides that information around how to help you select the right one. So there's lots of information out there on Comcare's website.
Cool. And we'll stick some links in the show notes.
Cool. Well, guys, it's been great chatting with you. There is one question, though, at this point in every podcast we like to ask our guests, and I might start with you, Kathy, on this one. What are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think...
Well, we've been sticking with it for about 250 episodes.
Oh, wow. Wonderful. I think that psychological health and safety is treated as equally as physical safety, and that in that way the harm can be prevented in the same way that the same urgency and importance that physical safety is given. And also, if I get another wish, that the stigma around mental health and workplace psychological injury no longer exists.
That's hard to follow up on. Sorry. What she said. No, I agree with, I share all of those wishes. I think, look, I talked earlier about kind of the Australian context and how some of the OECD figures in terms of mental illness in Australia are, you wouldn't think of if you just walk down, if you just engage in Australian society. So a lot happens, outside of the public eye. Look, I think my parting word, my wish would be that work is great. It's not just, we don't just get to compliance, which often as regulators we're always talking in terms of compliance. Does this meet the minimum threshold? Yes or no? We need to talk in that language. It's not accidental. That's just we're regulating the lowest bar, but our aspiration goes far beyond that. So we really want to see productive, safe and healthy workplaces, and the benefits of that flow far beyond health and safety. So what I would hope for is that Australian workplaces are looked at internationally as being the most safe and healthy places to carry out work, including the most psychologically safe.
Yeah, well, Australia has a great reputation for both mental health and health and safety. So, and definitely we know that there's a lot of multinationals looking very closely at what's happening in Australia in this space of psychosocial safety. So, I think, I don't think you're far off in terms of like, can we be world leading? I definitely think we can. Yeah.
All right, the last question for you both. Parting words of advice for listeners who are interested in working in the field of psychological health and safety. So maybe Kathy, do you want to go first again?
Yeah, look, I think if you want to work in the field of psych health and safety, go for it. If you don't know if it's right for you, there are many things that you can sort of do to test those waters and to start that journey that might get your foot in the door. And I think those things are to, if you're already in an organisation, exploring what's within your control, your circle of control there, like potentially looking into mental health first aid, being a HSR, volunteering as a peer support officer, and following all of the suite of education that's out there to sort of build your knowledge. I think that's, a good way to get your knowledge up, to get your foot in the door, but go for it.
Yeah, I think it's a very exciting time to be a health and safety practitioner or to be a regulator like we are. For existing work health and safety people, it can be a bit daunting as well. So just sit with that kind of feeling and please reach out for support from your colleagues, reach out to your communities of practice when you're tackling some of those complex issues. For work health and safety regulators, or for people outside of work health and safety regulation that might be thinking about a career in health and safety or in regulation, I'd strongly encourage it. You may not have heard much about health and safety. You might be more of a public health person or a legal person or someone with an interest in psychology. Definitely consider the impact that you can have working at scale like we do in the regulatory context or in other organisational psychology settings. It can be very rewarding. So I'd encourage anybody who's interested to consider that as a career path.
Yep, I agree. There's a lot of a lot of intrinsic reward in working as a regulator. Yeah.
And I think you're right, Kathy. There's ways for people to get a taste of psych health and safety. I still have some people say, I'm interested in psych health and safety, so I'm going to do an organisational psychology degree. Like, there's other ways to get involved, that's a big commitment.
It is a big commitment.
Yeah. Hey, look, it's been fantastic talking to you. We always love having regulators on the podcast. As Joelle said off air beforehand, they're always the most listened to podcasts, and I'm sure this one will be no different. Thank you so much for your expertise and willingness to come all the way to Perth to our studio to share with us and our listeners.
Thank you very much for having us. It's been great.
Yes, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for listening to my voice.
It was fine. Well, listeners, that brings us to the end of this episode. Remember, we do record these over video with our guests. And if you check out this video on the Flourish TX YouTube channel, you'll see our brand new set and how we squeezed 4 people into it on this particular occasion. We also share snippets, the best of these episodes on our Flourish TX LinkedIn page. So go over there to see some of the highlights of this and previous podcast episodes. And while you're on LinkedIn, feel free to connect with myself and Joelle, and we'd be happy to continue the conversation. But that's it for today. We'll catch you next episode.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.